Sure.
Welcome, everyone. I am Bonnie Jean Feldkamp. I'm the media director for the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, and I am thrilled to have David Maraniss here with us this evening. And David Maraniss, as everyone probably already knows, is a New York Times bestselling author, fellow of the Society of American Historians, and visiting distinguished professor at Vanderbilt University. His latest book is what inspired us to get in touch with him. It's his 12th book, and it's called A Good American Family, The Red Scare, and My Father. David has been affiliated with the Washington Post for more than 40 years as an editor and writer, and twice won Pulitzer Prizes at the newspaper. One in 1993 for his coverage of Bill Clinton, and in 2007, he was part of the team that covered the Virginia Tech shooting. He's also been a Pulitzer finalist 3 other times, including for one of his books, They Marched into Sunlight. He and his wife, Linda, a retired environmentalist, live in Washington, D.C. and Madison, Wisconsin, their hometown. And tonight he is joining us from D.C.
Yes.
Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Bonnie. Joe. I wish I could have made it to Tulsa last summer, but none of us could. So
yeah, I don't think anybody's made it anywhere for very long. Yeah. Well, I'd like to start off the evening for just reading the first paragraph of the jacket copy, just for for people who haven't read the book as of yet. I know we're going to talk about your writing process, but
sure.
It's good for people to know. And it's great jacket copy. Elliot Maraniss, David's father, a World War II veteran who had commanded an all-Black company in the Pacific, was spied on by the FBI, named as a communist by an informant, called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952, fired from his newspaper job, and blacklisted for 5 years. Yet he never lost faith in America and emerged on the other side with his family and optimism intact. And that comes through a lot in the book. And the first question I have for you tonight is your decision to write this book. What was it that prompted the research, and why now?
You know, it's probably in some ways a book that was inside me for a long time, but a couple of things prompted it. One was I knew I couldn't write it while my parents were still alive. The subject of their affiliation with the Communist Party as young people, the Red Scare era, were things that they really didn't talk about by the time I became sort of political consciousness, maybe at age 8 or 9. My father had survived that period, as had my mother, and they'd moved on to very successful lives. And I don't think they were embarrassed about it. It's just that it wasn't their focus. And so I knew that my father really didn't want me to root around in that period of his life, especially while he was alive. But what prompted it directly was my experience with a couple of my other biographies about the politicians Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, particularly the Obama book. What happened with that was here you had a president who, as a younger man, had written a brilliant memoir about his own experiences trying to find his identity and his Black identity. And you know, a couple of decades later, along came me, a biographer, to sort of look about what really happened as opposed to a memoir. They're two completely different ways of writing. Mm-hmm. And so when my book came out, there were several places where what Obama wrote in his book wasn't accurate history, but what he was told by his parents or grandparents or relatives and passed along as the family mythology. One very small example was, you know, his mother for a time was married to an Indonesian, and Barack writes in his book that his step-grandfather died heroically as a martyr fighting the Dutch in the Indonesian War of Independence. Mm-hmm. And I actually went to Indonesia and studied that and found out that his step-grandfather died falling off an ottoman in his living room, changing the drapes. So, you know, the right wing would go crazy about things like that, say, you know, Obama's a liar. And I kept saying, no, you have to understand how how many of us have biographers going back to find out what really happened in someone's life?
Mhm.
And that's what triggered my thought. There was a very important part of my family's history that hadn't really been explored, and became part of the mythology, but sort of hazy. And it was I was in my mid 60s. It was time for me to really go back and find out what happened.
Well, were there any family mythologies that you had to confront that weren't as you had heard them passed down? And what advice do you have for writers who are researching their family for vetting what grandma says? You don't want to say grandma's a liar. So how would you go about doing that?
Well, you just write it straight. You don't have to say what they said or not, but you tell the truth about what you find.
Gotcha.
I tried to approach it the same way I did any of my other biographies,
Okay.
with the same discipline of looking for archival records and letters and oral histories and whatever I can to track down the truth of what really happened. And in the book, I don't say, my father said this and it really happened like that. I just tell what really happened.
Right.
And it wasn't so much that anything he had said in our family was inaccurate. It was just an illusion. He never talked about it. It was just a hole in the, a lacuna in the family story.
Hmm. You talk about the family mythology is one of your manuscripts are four-legged animals, or the four table legs as
Right. You can say animals, sure.
it's a four-legged animal.
Yeah.
And so you talk about going there,
Yes.
get the documents,
Right.
interview as many people as possible, and then what you just mentioned is breaking through that family mythology to get to the truth. I was really taken in this book about the details that you grabbed by going there. The one that stands out to me is when you went to Spain and your wife mentioned the rosemary in the air, and how then your guide said that Spanish Civil War veterans wouldn't eat pork spiced with rosemary because to them, rosemary was the scent of battle. And I found that's awesome. So when did going there become part of your process? Is it just ingrained in you as a shoe leather journalist, or what is it that that made that such an ingrained part of your process?
Well, I've always believed deeply that to understand human beings, you have to understand the political and cultural geography of where they're from, the forces that shape them.
Mhm.
And so from my earliest reporting, I've always tried to go to the places of someone that I'm writing about. That's increased manyfold since I started writing books. Spending a lot of time in Arkansas for the Bill Clinton book, persuading my wife to move to Green Bay, Wisconsin in the winter with me for the Lombardi book. Those mortal loving words, how would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter? To which she responded, "Brr." But we went, and it made all the difference in so many little detailed ways. Just like going to Spain offered me not, both that detail of the scent of rosemary that I never would have gotten any other way, but by being there with a guide in the mountains near the river where many of the battles took place, or going to, for those who don't know, my uncle Bob, who was also called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, fought in the Spanish Civil War. And he was my mother's older brother and really kind of the ideological North Star of that family. And he was called before the committee the same week as my father. So he's another central figure in the book. And so I went to Spain to trace the steps that he took as a young graduate of the University of Michigan. He and two of his classmates took a boat across to France and a train across France and climbed over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. One of those three young students was captured by Franco's troops and executed in a church in the town of Alcañiz, in the cathedral. And that was another experience of driving through the serpentine, narrow streets of Alcañiz up to the cathedral on the top of the hill, and walking into that cathedral, and all of these 80 years later, it still had the sensibility of a dungeon of doom. You could feel the death inside that. So going there is so central to what I do.
Well, in the podcast Ink in Our Blood with your daughter, Sarah Maraniss Vanderschaft, it's a great listen. I really enjoyed it
Oh, thank you.
so far. And I'm curious if you researching your father is part of what inspired her to interview you. How did this podcast get started? And it's actually inspired me to interview my own father. I've already asked my dad, hey, I want to sit down, I have some questions. So that's definitely inspired me. Is that what inspired her?
It's very nice of you to say you enjoyed the podcast. I'm not a podcast person, so it was her idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that she has been thinking more about our family and my story and history over the last few years. And I think it was, she held a birthday party for me when I turned 70. I think that sort of got her thinking about, I don't like to think of it as some kind of morbid thought, but anyway, so she decided to do this podcast with me about the way I write and report and research, and that's how it came about.
Well, what advice do you have, or maybe I should be asking Sarah this question about interviewing your own family members? It can be intimidating when you know somebody personally versus professionally, especially when it's your parent. Do you have any advice for those who are researching?
Well, I have to confess something here, which is that around 1985 or so, I had the idea of writing a novel about a certain part of my family's life, which is in the book. It takes place in the Quid Cities of Iowa as we're coming out of the 5 years of the blacklisting and before we get to Madison, where our family is essentially saved. I wanted to try to write a novel about that period. And I went to interview my father, and we spent several hours talking, and parts of it were okay, but it's the one interview in my life where I really think that I failed, because he did not want to talk about his blacklisting experience or his time in the Communist Party. And because he was my father, and maybe because it was for a novel or whatever, I didn't push it. It's the one time in my career that I came away realizing that I hadn't done what I set out to do. My policy about interviewing anybody is to not make any promises, except that I will try to write it correct, that I'll get the story, understand it from their perspective, and present it accurately. So this isn't about interviewing a family member, but the strongest experience like that for me was in another book I wrote about the Vietnam War, They Marched into Sunlight, which involves a battle in Vietnam and a anti-war protest going on simultaneously in October of 1967. And there was a key figure in that book, a company commander, a soldier named Clark Welch, who had fought valiantly in the battle, which was a disaster. It was an ambush where 60 men were killed and 60 wounded out of 130 men. It was all the fault of superiors to him, but he was so haunted by that he really didn't want to talk about it for decades. And finally, I had interviewed enough other soldiers in that battle that he agreed to meet with me in Denver. He was living up in the hills north of Colorado Springs. And he came to meet me. And when we sat down, he said, "David, I'll promise to talk to you. I'll talk to you if you promise to be good to my boys." I said, "I can't make that promise. If I do, I'm going to break something. I mean, if I find out something that was wrong that happened in that battle and don't write it, then I'm breaking with the truth. If I write it, I'm breaking my promise to you. So I just can't make that promise."
And what does that mean to him? versus.
Well, he got up and said, well, you got to promise to be good to my boys. And he was about to walk away when I repeated what I'd said and explained it maybe a little more clearly. And he sat down and we built a level of trust that grew over weeks and months and years, where he gave me all of the letters that he'd written home from Vietnam. He went to Vietnam with me. My book changed his life, but it was because I was completely upfront with him, didn't play any games. And I always try to teach that to younger writers, that you can, it's not just the thing to do for your own ethics and integrity. It's also more effective in the long run.
Yeah, when everybody's on the same page. You actually got to, it's funny in the book, you talk about, I can't remember if it was in the book or in the podcast, I apologize.
Oh, that's all right.
But there was a gentleman who crossed both of your paths, Mort, in journalism.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was, so this is Morton Mintz.
Yeah.
Who's really a legendary figure at the Washington Post and among investigative journalists. He had done some really groundbreaking work on the Delcon Shield and some pharmaceutical scandals, and was at the Washington Post when I arrived there in 1977. And I was actually his editor for a while on the investigative staff in the early 1980s. So here I am in 2016 or 17. I had filed a Freedom of Information Act, several, to get my father's FBI files. The first batch came, and there was one page that said military intelligence file, and it was blank. Several months later, that military intelligence file came, and it was an investigation that had been done about my father when he was applying to be get into officer training school in World War II. And what happened was military intelligence sent investigators to investigate my father's life, including back to the University of Michigan, where he had been the editorial editor of the Michigan Daily in 1939. This is a couple of years later. And they go back to the Michigan Daily and interview the person who had succeeded him as the editorial editor. It was Morton Mintz, who I was the editor of at the Washington Post.
Right.
So, but that's not what struck me. Yeah. Morton Mintz told the FBI, the military intelligence, that they should never trust David Maraniss, that he was a Stalinist, that he would not be loyal to the United States, and I wouldn't let him be an officer. I was absolutely stunned, partly because I know that my father, when he came to visit the Washington Post, had met Mort. They seemed to be on friendly terms. Mintz went to the same high school as my mother in Ann Arbor. But beyond all that, he was a real maverick who was not the sort that would kowtow to authority in any way.
Gotcha.
So it really
stuck. What he said.
Yeah.
So.
And then, so he was 95 years old when I read this. He was still alive.
Wow.
And I contacted him and said, "Dear Mort, I have a very difficult issue to talk with you about, but I know that you have a reverence for the truth and for difficult things." And then I sent him a copy of the statement he had given to the military intelligence. And he wrote back and said, "David, that's the most shameful thing I've ever done in my life," which made me feel terrible. I didn't want this 95-year-old man who I admired in many ways to still harbor guilt about what had happened during a very difficult period of everyone's existence in that time. So I got together with him, we talked it over, but that, it was stunning to me that I would come across his name in that context.
Yeah, That's wild. That reminds me of another anecdote from the early college newspaper days, and that was about the photographer who came in looking for Ace, and how he said, "Oh, come on, I know Ace when I see him," when your dad was like, "Here I am," and he didn't believe him. I really liked in the book how you used that anecdote to illuminate your own difficulties with some of the stories that you were thinking and finding out about your dad. Was it difficult for you to put yourself into this book as opposed to, since you approached it like a biography? Was it hard for you to be more from the I perspective in this?
Yeah, it was. I mean, in two ways, both in terms of style and substance. You know, I've not written very much in the first person as a journalist. A few times I have in my books, only either in the introduction or epilogue of a couple of books. Like the Vietnam book, I was at the University of Wisconsin when the protests took place. I went to Vietnam with several of the survivors of the battle. So in the epilogue, I deal with that in the first person. But in this book, I knew that it couldn't just be the introduction or the epilogue, that I was going to be a figure in the book at various points. And to find the right voice where I could be both sort of the omniscient or the historian, the searcher, and a person in the book was something I was worried about. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how I could do that. And then on a separate level, even though I tried to approach the research as I would do any of my books, unavoidably, there was a much deeper emotional component to it.
Right.
The most emotional moment in the whole book is very early on in my research, when I was at the National Archives, going through the House Un-American Activity Committee files, which had been opened. And I knew from the transcript of the hearing when HUAC came to Detroit in February and March of 1952, and my father was called and fired from his job. When he was called before the committee, the transcript of that hearing is public record. It has been for decades. And so I had read it, my brother and sister had read it. We knew that part of the story. But in that transcript, my father says, "I have a statement I would like to read." And the chairman of the committee, John Stevens Wood, a segregationist from Georgia, determining who would be American or un-American, said that my father could not read the statement. He might have been able to had he confessed to his sins and named names, which my father refused to do. So here I am, all these decades later, at the archives in Washington. There's a file on those hearings in Detroit. There's a folder that says David Maraniss. I open the folder, and the first thing I see is Statement of David Maraniss. And it was the original copy of what my father had banged out on his old portable typewriter in 1952, with the keys sticking and letters jumping. And it was really seeing that made me feel for the first time what some semblance of what my father must have been thinking at that moment when he was in the crucible of the most difficult time of his life. That was very emotional for me. And it really drove sort of my sensibility throughout the book.
I bet. Now, here at the NSNC, we're all opinion writers, we're columnists. and I'm very curious, as a batch of opinion writers, your father wrote columns and editorials.
He sure did.
And what that must have been for you as a window into what he was going through at any given time.
Very much so. Yeah, he wrote for the Michigan Daily. He was the editorial editor and an essayist who would write about a wide variety of subjects, from the Tennessee Valley Authority to a novel by Richard Wright, to what was going on in Europe, as fascism was on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very lucky, Bonnie Jo, that right as I was doing the research, the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan was digitizing all of the old
Oh, wow.
editions of the Michigan Daily.
That's awesome.
And they hadn't gone online yet, but I got to know the archivists and they said they would let me look at them early.
Yeah.
So I could just type in the name David Maraniss and up popped 250 or so stories, mostly written by him. And that was invaluable in terms of understanding what he was thinking at that time. You know, that's why documents are so important when you're writing history. You could interview people about it, but to find contemporary thoughts, either in letters or essays, are so much more valuable. And I learned a lot about his writing through that and his thinking. Yeah. And sometimes I was, you asked me earlier about, sort of dealing with what my father was thinking during that period. Some of his essays were brilliantly written and completely indefensible. His rationalizations for the Soviet incursion into Finland in 1939, or pseudo defense of the Nazi, the Russia-Germany pact of convenience during that period. I thought he wrote them very well, but I was shaking my head thinking, Dad, what were you thinking?
That's wild. Yeah. You also said in the podcast, you said that it was that 1 hour of organization could save you 3 hours of writing.
Yes.
Can you talk for a minute? Like, so when you get this treasure trove of 250 things that your father wrote, what is your organization process? How do you take something like that and put it in a way that's usable for your book?
Well, I certainly would not recommend my organizational structure to anyone else. But probably I'm sure that people in your society are all different age groups. But I'm an older guy and I'm a techno idiot. So I'm still a paper person. So the first book I wrote, the Clinton biography, I actually used note cards. And I had probably 15,000 note cards organized by.
Did you put them on a ring so you could flip them, or did you?
No, they were in shoe boxes.
Okay. Oh
Yeah,
wow.
with so it'd be chronological and thematic, and it worked. Since then, I've mostly used 3-ring binders. For the book I'm writing now, I probably have 60 of them right around me here, and I organize them in several ways. Both chronology and subject and theme, and but a lot of it is just sort of intuitive. I'm not the sort that writes I have a friend, Rick Atkinson, a military historian writer, who writes outlines that are longer than his books, literally. I'm not like that. I have brief outlines that sort of are where I want to start a chapter and probably end it, what I call the stations of the cross along the way. And then I just let the magic happen from there with all the notebooks that I have and the facts and other things I've accumulated on my own thoughts about how to weave it together. But
journalist to author, that's really difficult. Was there something in that first book how did you get your arms around it for the first time when you were taking that plunge? Do you remember?
The first thing I did was interview Robert Caro and Taylor Branch and said, how do you do it? And I was lucky that I knew them both and they talked to me about how they organized. I didn't follow precisely what they did, but that helped a lot. And, Caro's admonition, turn every page, is something that rings in my head every time I go to an archive. Taylor actually did use note cards for parting the waters. So that's why I did it for my Clinton biography.
Okay.
And at the Post, over the years, I'd written a lot of their major profiles of politicians, going back to Jesse Jackson and Gary Hart and Bill Clinton, obviously.
Mhm.
And so I had experience doing longer form writing within the limits of a newspaper. And, I most of the most everything I learned from being a newspaper person helped me write books. I just, with a book, you have more freedom. And as long as you organize it and don't let the material overwhelm you, uh, I just found it exactly what I wanted to do with my life.
That's awesome. Do you transcribe your own interviews? I transcribe my own interviews because
Yes,
I think it gets my head in the game.
totally. I agree completely. There was one part of one book where I had us, back in the day, newspapers had transcribers, and so I gave some interviews to a woman at the Post who did that all the
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And I found that it didn't etch in my brain in the same way.
Mhm.
And really listening to an interview on tape, the first thing that happens is, I think almost anybody who does an interview, first thing they do is say, "Why did I interrupt that person?"
I just did.
You know, I mean, it's always, you sort of wince at listening to yourself do an interview. But secondly, you remember it. And and that's just so important to actually have it filter through your brain before it goes anywhere else. So yeah, I do transcribe all my interviews.
I have
And
people tell me all the time, there's an app that does that. There's an app that you can do that. The software does that. And I'm like, no, I don't want a software to do that.
yeah, I've had software that does that. I had one software where you could put it on a book and it would automatically transfer it to the computer. I was a disaster at that. Anyway, so I don't do any of those things, but there are people that save, countless hours with all of that technology.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the turn the page. And so how do you decide when you're finished?
With a book?
No, yeah, with your
Oh,
research portion, because
oh,
we
oh, oh,
turn
yeah.
every
So,
page, but there's
well,
always
that's in an
more.
archive itself. But how do I decide when I've done enough research? I never have.
No.
So my books, again, I'm sorry, I'm talking mostly about books here, but
Oh, no,
uh,
you're fine.
okay. Um, they usually, for some reason, they have the same rhythm. They take about 3 to 4 years.
Mhm,
The first year and a half, I just research. I don't write a word.
mhm,
I research and organize my research.
mhm.
And then at some point after about a year and a half or so, I'll start writing and keep researching as I'm writing um, till the day I'm done with the book. Because once you start writing, you see that the book is taking you to a few places that you hadn't fully researched.
Mhm.
I tend not to get writer's block. I'm lucky that way. And the only times I do is when I don't really have the material. So, for instance, I'm writing a book now about Jim Thorpe, the great Native American athlete. And I'm at a period in 1920 when the national foot, he was a gold medalist in the Olympics. He was a Major League Baseball player and one of the founders of the National Football League. So I'm writing about that year 1920 when the NFL was basically founded in Canton, Ohio, with Jim Thorpe there as the first president. And just today, as I'm writing that, I'm going back into newspapers.com,
Mhm,
and which is a fabulous resource,
mhm,
just incredible. You used to take months to go through old newspapers. You'd have to go to the Library of Congress, which I'm lucky enough to live in DC to do, or go to different cities and go through the old morgues to find stories. Now you go on newspapers.com, they're all there. So the Akron Beacon Journal from October of 1920, I've been going through that today and finding material that I didn't have as I'm writing it.
mhm. Now you talk about your new book, and um, so Alice Mayhew was your editor, and this
Yes.
was A Good American Family was the she worked on that book with you as well.
Yeah, that was, sadly she died early this year, or last year, I'm sorry.
How's that
But
process been for you since she was one of your first readers as well with the
she
new?
edited all 12 of my books.
Mhm.
But so did my parents when they were alive. They were first, and my wife also reads.
Mhm.
But I mean, Alice was a very important part of my life. But the truth is that I don't need editing for the writing. But what Alice was invaluable at was talking about the book as a concept and the structure of it and the themes of it. And so those are things that we mostly did before I started writing. And once in a while, I mean, she would read my chapters as I was writing them. I was never reluctant to let her do that.
Mhm.
And occasionally she would say, um, are you sure you want to turn in that direction yet, or something like that? But not anything structural, seriously. But it was more. It was, my relationship with her was more in the early stages of doing the book.
There's I've got one more thing for you, and then I'm gonna go look at the questions in the Q&A box here. I really like how you say that using facts to get at the truth, that you don't start a story with presumption, and instead you weave the story around the facts. And again, this is a group of columnists you're talking to and a group of opinion writers.
Well,
I
I'm a I can write opinion too. I wrote
right.
an essay for the Post on the,
Oh, sure. I
you
guess
know,
I'm
you know,
saying that because in our opinion, that's it's really important to have the facts inform your opinion. And
yeah,
I wanted to see how you feel about the current state of things in the world of commentary and the last 4 years, and how that's we've had a lot of facts woven around presumption. And
right. Well, you've had a lot of alternative facts woven around fallacies.
how do you see us getting back on track, for lack of a better phrase? Or do you have any advice for we opinion writers in our role in uniting this country?
I mean, I have as many opinions as anyone, and I love opinion. I mean, I used to read the sports section first.
Mhm.
Now I read the op-ed page first. I don't know what that says about sports or me or op-ed pages,
Yeah.
but I mean, I particularly read the Post and the Times op-ed pages, which have expanded. Especially the Post now is 3 pages, which I think is wonderful. Um, and all I'm looking for are a few things. One is to learn something.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not really wild about edit essays or opinion pieces that are only preaching to the choir and not illuminating in some way.
Mhm.
That's not to say that you shouldn't have a strong point of view,
Mhm.
but if you're just repeating what anybody who feels the way you do would feel anyway, I don't find any value in that. So to the extent that an opinion piece can through its writing, its sensibility, a sense of place, even of fact within the writing, can teach and illuminate. That's what I find the most valuable, and I think that's what the country needs.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree. I would agree. Okay, the Q&A panel here. I don't know if you can see it in front of you as well, but I've got it right here. Oh my goodness. Okay, so the first, Amy Abbott, she is actually working on a story revolving around Evansville, Indiana, I happen to know. And I know you mentioned Evansville in your book as well. But she wants to know, can you speak more about integrating your voice into the narrative, because it's a personal story? I'm writing a family history of a farm in my family from 1837 to
Uh-huh.
1937 and struggle with my editorial comment. Is it only appropriate for the afterword or preface? Former columnist, now writing books.
Yeah, Amy, my mother and her family lived in Evansville for a while. So I've only been there once in my life, but I feel that I know it.
Was that part of your
Um,
going there for the book?
Yeah, yes. I don't think you have to limit it to the afterword or preface. If it's a family story, um, and if you introduce yourself early in the preface or in the beginning of the story, it makes it easier for the reader and less jarring if you insert yourself at other points along the way. So I think you just have to develop a natural voice that allows you to weave back and forth between um, history and memoir in that sense. And when you find that voice, you can go back and forth more easily. But I wouldn't hesitate to try to do it that way. But introducing your voice in the first person early is important if you're going to do that.
She has a follow-up question of how do you decide what scenes and anecdotes to leave out?
Well, the first for something like what you're writing, the first and most obvious thing to leave out is anything that's not interesting. Why include it? The reader doesn't need it. If you don't think, if it doesn't advance the story in some important way, or if it isn't inherently interesting, leave it out. Everything does not have to advance the story. I'm of the school that enjoys taking a side road once in a while if it's interesting enough and compelling, and if you can snap it back to the main highway. Go ahead and do that. But anything that's not interesting, there's no reason for it.
We have another attendee who wants to know which one of your books was the most challenging yet inspiring to write.
Um, I would call it a tie between this last book and my Vietnam book. They Marched into Sunlight. This one, because it involved going so deeply into my family story, into places that were difficult, but very, not just revealing, but allowed me to understand myself better than I ever would have. The Vietnam book was different in the sense that I was not a soldier. I was against the war in Vietnam. I wouldn't have gone to Vietnam, but I really embedded myself with these old veterans who'd survived this horrible battle to the point where they made me an honorary Black Lion, which was their battalion. And one of them went to Vietnam with me. And what was so difficult about that is that they had all seen the worst that man can do to man and survived it. And the psychological trauma of that was something they carried for the rest of their lives. And in writing it, reporting it, talking so much with them, obviously some of that fell upon me. So, it's not that I had post-traumatic stress, but I was carrying a lot around with me, along with the burden of telling their story truthfully. So that was hard as well. And also the most important, those soldiers felt that I gave them an honor that they had been denied for many decades. The American government lied about their battle, said that it was a victory. They knew they'd walked into an ambush. They knew that the American government made up a body count about it, and they wanted the truth to be told, and I told it.
And They Marched into Sunlight is one that was on Pulitzer finalist. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. So Suzette Standring, she's a religion columnist, and she says, I'm struck by your statement that if your father were alive, you may not have written the book, and your later statement that you felt you failed in the interview with your dad. What is that emotion that made you pull your punches when it comes to a parent? I ask because I hear that from many writers as the greatest obstacle in writing memoir.
Well, there are a lot of memoirists, writers, who go ahead and do it, and their family members are still alive. Mm-hmm. And Fine. I'm not going to do that because I loved my parents too much. It wasn't worth it to me. Um, I have other things that I could write about. I had to write this book, but not to hurt my parents through it. But that's a personal decision that every writer makes. I mean, a lot of writers have made, a lot of fame and sold millions of books, denigrating their own families, or, maybe writing the truth about it, but splitting the family apart. I've always tried to write in a way that tells the truth and does it with a sensibility that doesn't, that still, yeah, I think you can write the truth and be honest and not lose people. But with my family, it was harder in that way. Uh, People have asked me what my parents would have thought of the book. And even though I say I don't think they would have wanted me to write it, I think they would have been fine with it once they read it. And I didn't pull any punches.
Yeah. I think considering the relationship you had with your father as a fellow newspaper man, he trusted you and knew your integrity. And your father in the book comes across as a very humble individual and gracious towards others, even though he was firm in his convictions.
Yeah, I wouldn't call him humble, but he was certainly gracious and warm-hearted and open to the complexities and contradictions in life. His own experience had made him that way. And that's why I feel lucky. He went through the worst that you can go through. And I was a beneficiary of that because he came through it, as you read in that opening, still an optimist. And yet with this very um, ability to understand people from all different perspectives and their flaws and fallacies, and not be strident about anything.
You got to work on the campaign trail together. Is that right? During one campaign,
Very early in 1976, I was the quote unquote national political reporter for the Trenton Times. I was 25 years old, and my father was still, he was the editor of the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. And we both covered the 1976 Republican convention in Kansas City.
that had to be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. And your next book on Thorpe, where are you in that process, and when can we see? When will that hit the marketplace? You take what, 4 years?
Because of COVID,
Mm.
no, it won't be that long. I'm already about 2 years into it.
Okay.
I started it, there's a time lapse between when you finish a book and when it's published. So
Right.
I had some time between when I finished Good American Family and it came out, and I was starting Thorpe then. But it's been different than any book I've written because I can't travel in the same way.
Yeah.
So before COVID hit, I'd been to many archives and done all of the archival work, or 80% of it. But I hadn't been able to do the go there part. I haven't gone to Stockholm, where the Olympics were held in 1912, that Jim Thorpe became a world figure. I haven't been able to I plan to spend 3 weeks in Oklahoma. Actually, I was planning to do that around your Tulsa convention last year.
How convenient. Yeah.
And there's an archive in Tulsa I wanted to go to, and then a lot over in Oklahoma City. And between the two is where Jim Thorpe grew up. So I couldn't do it. So I have to wait for whenever this horrible period makes it safe again to do that part of it. But I'm in the writing process. I've written many chapters and just have to do some of the go there to feel that part of it.
Do you take time off between books? Do you have a break when you put one to bed, or do you just dive right back in?
I'm kind of a hardworking, lazy person.
Okay.
So, I mean, I really am, I tend to, I don't take that much time off, but I mean, but in the middle of a book, I might go on a vacation. Well, don't do anything but write now because that's all, and go for walks.
Right. Yeah.
But maybe I try to have my next book idea before I finish the last one. I'm getting older, and I don't even know what my next book is. It could be the second volume of Obama, but I'm still waiting for his second part of his book to come out. So we'll see. But no, I mean, luckily I love every part of book writing. I don't consider it work. I really feel my whole career. There's parts of journalism that are difficult, but I think we're the luckiest people in the world that we get to do what we do.
Yeah, I agree. This is an interesting note from Rick Horowitz. He says, not a question, but an era that needs to be remembered. I'm nearly done reading your fine time capsule of a book. It turns revelatory and periodically sad and yet so inspiring. Loving your country and wanting it to live up to its ideals, there are far worse ways to live a life. Of course, I'm biased towards your dad to begin with. He hired my wife, Sue Ryan, at the Capital Times all those years ago. And that's where she met her great friend and yours, Whitney Gould.
Yes.
Gould, yeah. Thanks for sharing your family and your story with the rest of us. Best, Rick Horowitz. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Rick. Yes. My father was good at hiring too.
Yeah. Yeah. So Kathy Ellis-Q, she wants to know your editing process. You said you don't really need help writing, obviously, but working through some of what goes where. Who's your
So the first person who reads my books is my wife, Linda, who's an excellent reader. And we have this sort of, this will make me sound worse than I am, but I have to be honest about it. Okay. So it's almost kabuki theater. She'll read something and say, I really don't get this part. And I'll say, well, that's because, I'll start swearing and say, you're just too fucking dense to get it, but we've done it, but of course, every time I go back and fix it because she's always right. So it's become a joke. But anyway, so she has a very good sense of clarity, seeking, and sometimes when you're writing, things so well that you there's a tendency to assume. And so she's very good at that.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Then like for the Thorpe book, I have a few friends that tend to read my manuscripts, some because they just want to do it, some because I really love their perspectives. For this book, I have 3 Native Americans who are going to read it because I'm not, indigenous. I want to get it right. And luckily I have some very smart and generous friends who will do that, or people acquaintances that I've met at Northwestern and Yale, professors who are American Indians. I've been an editor a lot of my life. It's not quite like saying, a client who hires himself as a lawyer is a fool. I mean, it's different when you're a writer and editor. I mean, I don't catch everything, but I have a editor's sensibility. So I probably need less editing in that sense. I definitely need a copy editor, and love the copy editors who go back over the books, that Simon & Schuster hires.
Dave Astor is our copy editor, and he is invaluable.
Oh, Dave is my cousin-in-law.
I know. He's how we got in touch with you, and he is our copy editor, and I don't know what I would do without him.
Yeah, no, copy, and that's, boy, the loss of copy editors. And I mean, there's so many things about local newspapers now that make me sad and angry. But the decimation of copy desks is one of them.
Yep, I agree. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to give our last question to our intern this semester. She's interning with us, and she wants to know what advice you have for writers just starting out working on books.
I see that, and she says working on novels.
Yeah, she writes and reads novels, but I'm going to
don't follow my advice. I tried and realized that I don't have that part of my brain. I love to write in a what you might call novelistic fashion, but I need the gist of facts to do it with. Jamie, I don't know if I have any profound advice that you haven't heard elsewhere, but the first advice is to write, period. Just keep writing. When you read other writers, you don't want to mimic or copy anyone, but there are definitely ways that you can study other people's writing that you really admire and try to figure out how they did it and the pace and rhythm and a lot of different ways that you can study writing and then find what's natural for you. All writers are, I shouldn't use the word plagiarist, but all writers learn from other writers, and you take what you really think fits you from each of those people. So keep reading and writing is the simplest way to answer that question. Sorry, I don't have anything deeper than that.
She's a pretty impressive reader. I think in this pandemic, she said she's read almost like 75 books or something crazy. So
fabulous.
She's a great reader. So I have no doubt that will transfer to
Yes.
her page when she sits down to write.
Yeah.
So.
The key is, find your voice.
Yeah.
One thing I've talked a lot about, and you want to find this is my opinion, and talking to columnists about this might be the wrong audience to talk to it about. But I've often found that if you want to be able to write about anything, you have to avoid certain traps. And one trap is finding a voice that works and is popular, but doesn't allow you to write about many things except sort of the snarky voice that you've developed, which is in a sense artificial. And so you want to try to find the more natural voice you find, the more that allows you to write about a wider world.
I like that. I think that's a good note to leave on. Thank you so much for being here, David. I really appreciate you taking the time and spending an hour with us. And everyone else, thank you so much. I'm Bonnie Jean Feldkamp, the media director for NSNC, and this is David Maraniss. If you have not read it yet, this is the book. I got the audio book, so I knew how to pronounce things. And I got the book from the library because I would have screwed up. We didn't even say her name, Maraniss Baldwin. I would have said that.
You got
wrong.
it.
That's right. Thanks to your audiobook, I got it right. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Bonnie Jean. This was really fun.
It was a lot of fun.